The red telephone box used to be everywhere in Britain before mobile phones came along. The one most people picture is the K6, designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott for King George V's Silver Jubilee in 1935. At their peak in 1982, there were about 92,000 of them across the UK. Now only about 9,000 traditional red ones remain. Most have been removed, but some got a second life. Communities can adopt them and turn them into lending libraries, defibrillator stations, or even tiny coffee stands. The milkman used to turn up before you were awake, leaving cold glass bottles on your doorstep while you slept. You'd hear the clink of glass and the quiet whir of his electric float around 5 or 6 in the morning. By 1975, 94% of British households got their milk this way, fresh from local dairies in reusable bottles. The milkman knew your order by heart and would bring extra on Saturdays. Then supermarkets arrived with cheaper milk in plastic containers, and by the Latininides, most people switched over for convenience. Now there's only about 9,000 milkmen left in the whole country. Walk into any British pub before 2007 and you'd find ashtrays on every table. They were part of the furniture as standard as beer mats or salt shakers. Most pubs had branded ones with brewery logos or their name on them. When the smoking ban hit on July 1, 2007, they all vanished overnight. Pubs replaced them with flower pots in some cases or just left the tables bare. The ashtrays got binned, stolen as souvenirs, or sold to collectors. This marked the end of something normal for nearly 2 centuries. Woolworths was one of those shops you just assumed would always be there. Everyone called it Woolies, and it sat on practically every British high street for the best part of a century. You'd pop in for school socks, birthday cards, cheap CDs, whatever your mum needed for the kitchen. The real draw, though, was the pick and mix, those massive clear bins full of cola bottles and fizzy dummies where you'd shovel sweets into paper bags. When all 800 stores shut in early 2009 after going bust in the credit crunch, it left actual gaps in high streets and 27,000 people without jobs. Coal fires were how British homes stayed warm through most of the 20th century. Your sitting room fire and kitchen range both needed feeding with coal delivered by the coalman. You couldn't mistake him with his face, and clothes caked black from coal dust and white rings around his eyes where he'd rubbed them clean. He'd lug 100-weight sacks from his cart and heave them into your bunker. Then you'd tip him a few pennies for the back-breaking work. The Clean Air Acts from 1956 pushed smokeless fuels, and central heating gradually replaced it all by the 70s and 80s. Telegrams were the go-to for urgent messages and special occasions for over a century. British Telecom shut down the service in 1990 after 112 years. The reason was simple enough: the telephone had taken over. In 1945, Britain sent 63 million telegrams, but by 1991, that dropped to just 2 million. The phone was faster, and most people had access to one by then. The decimal halfpenny coin stuck around for 13 years after 1971, but by 1984, it had become completely pointless. People wouldn't even bend down to pick one up in the street. The Treasury worried that getting rid of it would cause inflation as shops rounded prices up, but eventually admitted hardly any transactions used it. The Royal Mint stopped making them in February 1984, and by December it was no longer legal tender. At just 17 millimeters across, it was the smallest coin Britain had circulated, and when it went, it took the last fractional penny with it. Football rattles were wooden noisemakers that fans spun by a handle. You'd hold the grip and whirl it around, making a toothed wheel smack against wood to create this incredibly loud clacking sound. They originally came from World War II when air raid wardens used them to warn about gas attacks. After the war, surplus rattles found their way onto the terraces and got painted in team colours. In the 1970s, they were banned from most grounds because they could be used as weapons in the packed standing sections, especially with hooliganism getting worse. Video rental shops were massive in Britain through the 90s and early 2000s. Every high street had at least one, usually a Blockbuster with its blue and yellow sign. Friday nights meant walking in, browsing rows of VHS tapes and later DVDs, picking something for the weekend. The smell of plastic cases, the thrill of finding what you wanted in stock, the late fees if you forgot to return it on time. By the early 2010s, streaming services killed the whole business off. Blockbuster shut its last UK stores in 2013, and that was pretty much it for the video shop era. Bus conductors walked up and down the aisles collecting fares and issuing tickets from machines strapped to their chests, chatting with passengers while the bus was moving. They'd ring a bell, usually 2 dings, to tell the driver when it was safe to pull away from stops. The job started back in 1829, but began fading after 1966, when British regulations allowed driver-only operation. Through the 70s and 80s, routes switched over as new bus designs and electronic payment systems let drivers handle everything themselves. London's last conductor buses finished in 2005. Green Shield stamps started in 1958 when Richard Tompkins copied an American loyalty scheme. Shops gave you stamps based on what you spent, roughly 1 for every 6p. You stuck them in books, then exchanged filled books at Green Shield shops for gifts from a catalogue, anything from kettles to televisions. Tesco joined in 1963, and stamps were everywhere through the 60s and 70s. But Tesco dropped them in 1977 to cut prices and compete with discount stores. Other retailers followed, and by the 80s the scheme had mostly died off. Chimney sweeps were everywhere in Britain once, clambering across rooftops and disappearing down flues with their brushes and rods. Every street had one, turning up regularly to scrape out the soot and creosote from burning coal. But once central heating took over and coal fires disappeared, the work dried up. Open chimneys became rare instead of standard, so there wasn't much need for cleaning them anymore. These days, chimney sweeps still exist, but they're specialists dealing mainly with wood-burning stoves or heritage buildings. What was once a common sight has become something you'd struggle to find. In working-class areas of Yorkshire and Lancashire, women scrubbed their front doorsteps every Friday night or weekend with a block called a donkey stone. These blocks were made from crushed sandstone, cement, and bleach, leaving a white or cream coating on the stone. You could tell who kept a clean house just by their step. Housewives got the stones from rag and bone men in exchange for old rags, and whole streets competed for the whitest steps. It was about pride, showing neighbours that even if you were poor, you weren't dirty. The practice died out in the 1960s. Wimpy opened in Britain in 1954, and by the 70s there were over 500 of them across the country. Every high street had one. Then McDonald's showed up in 1974, and that was essentially game over. Wimpy had table service, proper cutlery, china plates, the full sit-down restaurant setup. McDonald's understood speed and disposable everything. Today, there are fewer than 100 Wimpys left, mostly in drab seaside towns. They're famous for the Bender Innebun, which is a bent frankfurter that looks vaguely wreath-shaped. Teletext was a text-based information service that came through your telly starting in 1974. It worked by tucking data into the invisible gaps in the broadcast signal at the top and bottom of your screen. You'd punch in a 3-digit page number on your remote and wait a few seconds for it to load. The BBC's version was called CFAX, and it gave you news, weather, telly listings, and sports scores. Most television sets in Europe had a decoder built in by the 1990s. The whole thing went dark in 2012 when digital TV took over. National service meant that every fit young man between 17 and 21 had to serve in the armed forces, whether he wanted to or not. It ran from 1914 until 1960, and nearly 2 million men went through it. You did 18 months initially, later extended to 2 years, then stayed on reserve for 4 more. When your call-up papers arrived, you showed up for a medical. If you passed, it was off to basic training. 6 weeks of freezing barracks, sergeant majors screaming at you constantly, terrible food, endless drill, polishing boots, and cross-country runs at absurd hours. Rag and bone men wandered Victorian streets with a horse and cart, calling out rags, bones, bottles. They collected anything they could sell on, old metal, worn clothes, bones, glass jars, and paid you for it, sometimes in money, sometimes in sweets. Bones got ground up for fertilizer or boiled to make glue. Rags went to paper manufacturers, since paper was made from linen and rag back then, and metal went for scrap. The trade barely paid, though. Estimates put daily earnings at 6p, less than £2 today. Modern recycling services replaced them. Police boxes started appearing in British cities from the 1890s, with the famous blue design coming in 1929. These boxes contained a telephone linked to the station, a fire extinguisher, and first aid kit. An officer could duck inside with a key and fill out paperwork or temporarily hold someone they'd arrested. Most people know them from Doctor Who's TARDIS. By the 1970s, radio made them obsolete and they were removed. Outdoor washing lines used to be everywhere in Britain. You'd see them strung across backyards, stretched between houses, running down the length of entire gardens. Monday was wash day, and out the washing went, shirts and sheets and smalls flapping for the neighbourhood to see. The tumble dryer changed that, offering privacy and convenience regardless of weather. But shifting tastes played a part as well. Some new housing estates actually ban visible washing lines now, viewing them as common, and most people have moved their drying indoors entirely, away from public view. CNA was a Dutch clothing retailer started by brothers Clemens and August Brenink Meager. They opened their first British store in 1922, and people called it Coats and ATS. For decades, it sold budget clothes to families who found Marks and Spencer a bit pricey. By the 1980s, though, new chains like Matalan were selling trendier gear for less, while supermarkets started their own fashion ranges. CNA was losing £1 million a week. The company closed all 109 UK stores in 2000, ending 77 years on the high street. For most of the 20th century, shops in England and Wales had to stay shut on Sundays. This came from the Shops Act 1950, which made buying and selling on Sundays illegal. The idea was to preserve Sunday as a day of rest and religious observance. Then in 1994, the Sunday Trading Act changed everything. Large shops could now open for 6 hours between 10 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and small shops could open whenever they wanted. The traditional quiet Sunday, with families at home after church and nothing much happening on the high street, was over. Before on-screen guides and streaming apps, finding out what was on telly meant buying a printed TV listings magazine. The Radio Times launched in 1923 and became a permanent fixture sitting next to the remote in British homes. Every week you'd buy your copy, flip through the pages, and circle what you wanted to watch. Cable boxes started the decline with their electronic guides showing schedules at a button press. Then streaming services finished the job by making scheduled programming feel almost irrelevant. The magazines still exist, but sales have collapsed dramatically. In 1946, Britain started giving every schoolchild under 18 a free third of a pint of milk each day. The idea was nutritional, making sure children got proper nourishment after the war. This carried on until 1971, when Education Secretary Margaret Thatcher cut free milk for children over 7 years old. The government needed to save money, and school milk was costing £14 million a year. People were absolutely furious about it. Thatcher ended up stuck with the nickname Milk Snatcher, or the full chant Thatcher Thatcher the Milk Snatcher. British rail sandwiches were notoriously terrible from 1948 until privatisation. They were kept under glass domes at station buffets, which made the corners curl, or wrapped in cling film, which made them soggy. The fillings were measured precisely: 3/4 of an ounce of cheese, 2/3 of an ounce of luncheon meat, but they sat around for hours anyway. The Goon Show did an entire episode about them in 1954. British Rail still sold 8 million in 93, their final year. Privatisation brought in outside catering companies with fresh sandwiches, ending the national joke. British schools required fountain pens right through to the 1960s. Every desk had an inkwell built into it with a brass cover that slid back. You filled your pen by dipping the nib into ink and working a little lever on the side that squeezed the rubber reservoir inside. This drew ink up through the nib. The whole process was inevitably messy and left your fingers permanently stained with ink that wouldn't wash off. Schools initially banned ballpoint pens when they arrived because teachers reckoned they ruined handwriting, but eventually biros took over and ink-stained fingers became history. Those little 10ml HP sauce sachets used to be everywhere in cafes, canteens, and greasy spoons across Britain. You'd find them in a basket on the table or handed out with your bacon sandwich. They were convenient, hygienic, and meant nobody had to share a crusty bottle with sticky fingerprints all over the cap. But rising costs hit catering businesses hard, and environmental concerns about single-use plastic packaging started making sachets look wasteful and outdated. These days, you're far more likely to see a squeezy bottle or pump dispenser on the counter instead. British workplaces used to shut down twice a day for proper tea breaks, 10:30 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon like clockwork. The tea lady would wheel her trolley round with a steaming urn, biscuits, maybe some scones. Everyone stopped what they were doing and gathered for a chat and a cuppa. It wasn't optional really, it was just what you did. These days, that ritual has mostly vanished. Modern work culture expects you to keep working at your desk with a takeaway cup beside you. London's Routemaster buses first rolled out in 1956 and became one of the city's most recognisable symbols. They were double-deckers with an open rear platform instead of doors, which meant you could hop on and off between stops. Each bus had a conductor collecting fares, which was nice for passengers but expensive to staff. The design used lightweight aluminium and squeezed 72 passengers into the longer versions. By 2005, London withdrew them from regular service because that open platform was dangerous and the high step made them impossible for disabled people to board. You can still ride them on heritage routes today. Cheque guarantee cards worked alongside your checkbook from 1965 onwards. When you handed over a cheque in person, the person receiving it wrote your card number on the back, which guaranteed the payment up to 50 or 100 quid. Even if you didn't have enough money in your account, the bank had to honour it. Tradesmen like plumbers and electricians loved these because they knew they'd definitely get paid. Debit cards gradually replaced them during the 1980s, and by 2011 banks scrapped the guarantee system entirely. If you used the internet in the 90s or early 2000s, you remember that sound. Your modem would dial your internet provider and screech through a series of beeps and static whilst the machines negotiated the connection. This took 15 to 30 seconds, and once you were online, nobody could ring your house because the phone line was occupied. Downloads maxed out at 56 kilobits per second, meaning a single web page could take minutes to load. Broadband started appearing in the late 90s, and by the mid-2000s most people had switched over, ending this slow, patience-testing era.